Hello and welcome to yet another JNUC. Today we're going to have a security thought leadership roundtable, and we've brought together leaders in security to discuss the current state of the industry, the lessons learned from this year's attacks, and how organizations can protect themselves. With us on the panel today is Aaron Kimley, Jamf's CISO, and today he's wearing a white hat, but normally he might be found with a black hat. Sarah Edwards, Senior Digital Forensics Researcher at Cellebrite, and John Mallman, Mac Engineering Lead and CIO Services at Leidos. So, Aaron, it seems like security has expanded from we scan for bad things to add in identity, event monitoring, state management, heuristics, and all that and much, much more. So what are the new subfields? I feel like, when we're walking around Black Hat or DEF CON and we see all these booths and there's all these kind of emerging subfields. So what do you see as those and how they fit into the overall picture?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, security is always changing. It follows the risk. From securing the endpoint to effective perimeters to zero trust, we've always been charting new territory to secure the win. Hopefully, we're ahead of the curve, but sometimes we're being led by the nose, right? With attackers and evildoers setting the pace. I think new subfields, I'll propose one from each side, right? Push and pull. On the proactive side, getting ahead of problems, DevSecOps continues to be leading the way. Privacy, security by design. It's more than just ensuring quality code. It's a model for designing products to be more secure from the idea phase on, making security and privacy a core capability of the product and how it works, a core part of that value story, rather than just a simple attribute. On the other side, an area where attackers are forcing us to change, AI ML is another area that's changing the game. Malware that evolves its attack strategy based on large samples of live data that it's gathering as it's working. Attack frameworks that can do more than can just execute known attacks, but can evaluate findings and extrapolate layered, complicated attack chains. I think this is what we're looking for in the near future.
Yeah, it certainly feels like no stone is left unturned. If a developer 10, 20 years ago forgot to click a button or do something really tiny, it feels like that might have, escaped as a defect for years potentially before anyone noticed. And now it feels like you do that, and by the time the beta's done, it's already been reported to the vendors. Just so many security researchers, so many people just pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And Sarah,
as the news keeps telling us, we keep finding these 20-year-old vulnerabilities as well.
Yeah. The 20-year-old ones are potentially the most scary to me because they're just on so many devices now. So Sarah, what are the biggest issues we've seen in the past year, and what would you say is emerging that we'll see more of?
I think probably one of the largest pieces is that the real world, everyone outside of everybody who does Apple stuff, is realizing that these devices can actually be compromised. You have a fully patched device, it can be compromised. Now, whether or not you are one of those super high level targets that are being targeted by NSO Pegasus, that's another question. But I think the realization out there really is you're not always going to be safe. Now, it's not just the NSOs of the world. It's also the commodity malware. It's the adware. It's the ransomware. It's a realistic threat that's going to be on Apple devices. So while it's not necessarily new, I think it's new to the rest of the community, the rest of the world.
Yeah, and it also seems apparent that all of those things move kind of down market, right? So whereas something might be specifically targeting large organizations, over time, those things kind of move down, just like, great enterprise features, AI/ML, as Aaron mentioned, that used to be a pretty upmarket thing in the hallowed halls of the MIT research type facilities with John McCarthy. But now, you know, run of the mill malware can pull a microservice that's using NumPy or some Python framework and just plow through lots of data in a very small period of time. Do you see that as being the AI/ML side as being impactful as well?
I can't say that I've really looked at the AI ML side too much. Maybe it's still out of the realm of what I'm researching right now. But sure, it could absolutely be a thing in the future.
And for anyone who's tapping in who might not have used any of the tools that you've built, do you want to take us through what any of them do? Because
Which
you're
tools?
awesome and have built lots of tools. Any of the forensics tools, maybe?
So I'll talk about my own personal tool set. And this is, I'm guessing you're talking about the Apollo tool set,
Mm-hmm.
possibly? Okay.
Yep.
Just want to make sure that I'm going with the right one here. So the Apollo tool set is really something that I use from a forensic side to gather as much information from devices as possible. This information can be anything from what are you listening to? What applications are you running? What are your network services? What applications? What have you installed? What have you deleted recently? What's the volume? When were you last plugged into something? So this is what I call Apple pattern of life. Really the nitty gritty, creepy details of what you've been doing on your device to help me in my investigations. Now, that doesn't mean I'm using them for, hopefully good purposes, but hopefully others are not abusing those same services as well.
Yeah, it's crazy how much stuff is hidden in little encrypted SQLite databases all over devices. So
Mhm.
thank you very much for all of those contributions. You've been an excellent member of the community for a long, long time. So, John, it's always interesting to talk to customers and especially those who are kind of on the front line in platform engineering. Working from home has become unexpectedly widespread, I guess you could say, in the past year or year and a half.
Definitely.
What kinds of security considerations has this introduced?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So for those not familiar, Leidos is a DoD contractor, so we work on a lot of different platforms. We have to follow a lot of different compliances, DFARS, NIST 800, CMMC, and so the good news is that Leidos had a pretty robust workforce from the start, robust remote workforce before COVID started, because since we are a contractor, we're everywhere. We have people working at home, we have people working in SCIFs. It's pretty widespread, but we still have to keep a tight hold on things like what networks you could connect to and what data can be sent over that network. But being a DoD contractor, we also have to look at things like what hardware are you plugging into your device specific to the vendor or the vendor ID. So when you're plugging in a mouse or something, we have to make sure that it's doesn't have a chipset from a vendor that we don't approve of. And working in an office, usually that's a little easier to control. They're on the corporate network, so we can see everything. They use corporate hardware, printers, scanners, you name it. It's all corporate provided. But when you're at home, you might have your 20-year-old laser printer sitting behind you that, hasn't been updated and they need software for it. And, we have to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't install that. Or they have a Wacom tablet or a Wacom tablet that they want to plug in and, or it's a off-brand that they, there's a lot of times where you have to say no to the endpoint, to the end user saying, I'm sorry, it's not approved, or, well, that has a chipset that is not approved. It's made by XYZ company and they're known as a nefarious company for dealing with U.S. contractors. So during the work from home push early on in it, our company did a pretty large posture shift in terms of allowing more devices and more brands to connect to computers. We took a look at a lot of drivers, a lot of hardware, and said, okay, these were on our list before. Let's remove them, and as long as it's made after a certain period of time. And the other one is, since they're not on VPN all the time, we had to really fine tune our firewall policy. not everyone, since everyone's not connected, you still need to make sure that, okay, everything that's going out of that machine or coming into that machine is safe. So we had to really look at what our local firewall policy was. So when you're not on the corporate network, you're still protected. We're still keeping you safe, and we're still keeping our data safe. So it was a pretty big paradigm shift there for our security folks.
You know, it does feel like controlling what goes in and out of machines is increasingly important. Do you find tooling like zero trust networking, while it's not VPN, it's kind of tunneling, so it's kind of VPN, but do you find those different types of tool sets to be important for a modern distributed workforce?
I think so. I certainly, our network security team and our cybersecurity team would say yes, 100%. All of that is very important. All those tools put together are very important. So I certainly think that, yeah, you have to make sure, though, that you have them all built properly and spec'd for your environment. What works on your Windows machines or your Linux machines is not going to work on your Macs, and vice versa. And thankfully, I've been blessed with a very good team that can make all of these changes across the gamut on all of our platforms.
And that team's probably been working some pretty long hours the past year and a half, trying to pivot so quickly.
Yeah. So in my other, I'm doing a talk this year, JNUC, on how we secured our Mac environment for CMMC, and that CMMC is a pretty new compliance. It's a government level compliance, and it's very new. I think version 1 came out last January, and we were doing one compliance for years, and then suddenly, oh, here's this new one. Now we have to go do that. But also we're in the process of, oh, wait, all these upgrades are coming. macOS Monterey is coming. Hey, we have to test that too. And oh, we're taking away tools from our developers, so we have to make sure that the development platform works for them. So now we have to change things for that. So it's been a very, very busy time, not just for cybersecurity, but honestly as a Mac engineer, it is extremely busy, because of all the changes that Apple does with, unfortunately, not a lot of announcement, but with all the beta testing going on, we at least get a lot of time to play around and break things.
Yeah, with an annual release cadence, you're kind of in a continual DevSecOps with release management for the Mac now.
100%.
So, Aaron, Aaron, how do we see organizations reorienting their time, effort, and money to address these issues that we're talking about?
Sure. While the security fundamentals remain the same as they've always been, added weight needs to be placed behind those things you can control for remote work, and you need better awareness of the things you can't control, right? Identity and access management, configuration management, asset management, all these bubble to the top again. It gets increasingly difficult to know who is doing what is being accessed. It's harder to measure for remote workers. Data management, least privilege, again, these core fundamentals, right? Effective governance is needed to ensure where your data is moving in this new model, now that you can be less certain about the underlying systems or the networks that they're on. Moving away from monolithic VPNs into a world of split tunnels and mixed trust, zero trust application connectivity, getting performance and security into a level of risk that we can live with in this new model, especially now that you have no visibility into what access point or router or network architecture, who is on the network that your user is on. These things become very difficult to know. So it's all a super interesting problem set. Lots to learn. I think we're still evolving, but a focus on the fundamentals and a willingness to set aside those things that you just can't control and focus on what you can, I think, is the key component.
And the amount of telemetry that we have today is just so much more than ever before. How do you feel about all that data flooding in and having to parse it and deal with it?
And this is another shift over the last maybe 10 years, right? We're past I want all the data, give me everything. We're into a realm now where we have to be very cautious about what data you collect. not only is there a privacy consideration, but also most of that data doesn't help you achieve your goals. So how do you find exactly what you need, and take all this sea of telemetry and boil it down to the data points you need to accomplish the goal of securing the environment? It's tricky and constantly evolving.
Yeah, you can't just pipeline syslog into some server and use an elk stack to scan it all anymore, can you?
You certainly can, but you are going to end up spending all your time managing your log aggregator and none of your time evaluating risk.
Yeah. So, Sarah, kind of shifting gears from this network work from home type stuff, what moves from Apple have you seen that have had the biggest security impact in the past year or three? Because they've been on a tear recently, it feels like.
Yeah, and it's not always stuff that they are truly implementing. It's stuff that they're specifically not implementing. And what I mean by that is that Apple products are still, especially iOS devices, are still very much a black box system. Unless you go in there, you jailbreak and see all the things, you truly have no idea what the heck is going on with these devices. And from a security research standpoint, that makes securing the device kind of difficult. So that is, I think, one of the biggest things in this realm here. And going again with the security researchers is the bug bounty program. So they have one, they advertise it. They're like, yeah, we have a bug bounty program. But I've seen a lot of folks in the community say, oh, well, it doesn't quite work as advertised. Whether researchers are not getting paid out for it, they might mean well, but it doesn't really work out in the long run. So I think there needs to be a little work with that. And then as far as actual implementations, I think the big one that I've come across is the kernel extension to system extension one. That's the one that I have mostly focused because I still have a lot of tools that use kernel extensions from a forensics tool set. And I know a lot of folks, they're having issues even trying to get those system extension entitlements. They're waiting months to actually get them. So a lot of the tools can not even be updated from a security standpoint as well. So it's just a few things. It could go on, I'm sure.
Digging into that a teeny bit, the long-term benefits of moving from kernel extensions to system extensions, as an example. With system extensions, you have to enable hardened runtime. So from a security research standpoint, we're sitting there saying, okay, well, I've always used dtrace or LLVM or, a number of tools in my arsenal to scan for these vulnerabilities. And now none of those work. It's all dead because, the developer has to check that secure runtime. And now that hardened runtime is no longer accessible to any of those tools. And so I like where it's going, and it's somewhat frustrating that we have to move as quickly as we do, but yet the changing landscape, the changing threat landscape is just evolving so rapidly for a variety of reasons that I kind of get why it's happening at the pace it's happening. Although it does mean teams like John's are probably sitting there scratching their head like, oh, I have to swap out a vendor all of a sudden at the last minute because this doesn't support it anymore.
I was actually just going to add to that because it is a struggle. We some of our vendors can't keep up with the cadence because, like you mentioned, it's like a black box for them. And when Apple takes away their ability to do something that they've done for, say, 15 years on their product, and then suddenly, doesn't work. Now they have to scramble and try to figure out how to fix that. And a lot of these vendors, frankly and unfortunately, don't have a huge Mac development team, and it stalls. So we might have to wait into deploying the latest OS X amount of months because the vendor has to catch up.
Mm-hmm. And I know some of those developers who are like, well, you haven't paid down any tech debt for 10 years. So sorry that you have to do it in an accelerated fashion. But if you amortized it across the last 10 years, you're still doing pretty good.
Hindsight.
Yeah. So, John, there are times in security when you don't want to rely entirely on one company, as we're talking about. What types of technology do you see as necessary to supplement Apple's native security?
So I want to preface this with saying that I've yet to find a single vendor that does everything right across platform. Right, there is no vendor that will do everything you need to secure a device across your platform everywhere. If you could find one, please let me know, but there is no one vendor out there. And even if you think you found a vendor that supports everything and does a good job, talk to the people that are managing it, because I guarantee you that you're not. It's not one size fits all. It's going to be whatever works best for your team. So I've actually had to present this type of information to my security team, and I had Apple. We presented it to Apple as well. Apple has a lot of great built-in tools, right? MRT, Gatekeeper, XProtect, SIP. These are all really good tools and ways to secure your environment. But they don't meet specific requirements. So CMMC, for example, which again, it's a pretty high standard. It has 5 levels, I believe. There are some major components that lack meeting some of those requirements. So one of them is you need to be able to scan an entire machine and produce a report stating that it's been clean or has been remediated. And you need that auditability, because you need to make your compliance records known. Like, hey, to win a contract, you need to say, yes, we are CMMC level 4. Here's our records. You can't do that with the built-in products without a third-party product. So yes, the tools can remediate malware and other bad actors, but these are all on-access scans. They're reactive and not proactive. And honestly, in our environment, we need to be reactive, and a lot of environments need to be reactive. So, almost forgot the question, but so a major tool, though, right, that macOS lacks, basically, and I'm always going to hear excuses and reasons as to why it's not needed, but I'm just going to say it is an antivirus, an actual antivirus. And as much as we will say Macs don't get viruses, okay. They don't, but they do at the same time. I'm sorry. And we need something to scan the system and say, okay, here's auditable proof that we are keeping our endpoints clean and scanning. That's just one major one that Apple usually lacks. And whenever I try to point, my security team, I say, here's MRT, here's Gatekeeper, here's XProtect, here's all this other thing. They go, no, that's not good enough. I'm sorry. It doesn't meet our compliance. And whatever their compliance, I'm using air quotes there, would be, it still doesn't meet it for them. I've tried to talk with cybersecurity teams about this, and it just doesn't meet it for them. So that's definitely one of them that's lacking.
Yeah, 100% agree. I completely understand. I mean, if we can, for example, form an SMB connection into a machine, drop off an object, and then have that object runnable, then MRT is not scanning it proactively. And ergo, we need something else to be doing the routine scans, even if it's as simple as MRT scripting or something much more complicated, like where Jamf Protect or some other tools get us. So it's funny having sat in both chairs like Aaron, I feel like I get both sides of all of these. And sometimes I err these days on the side of caution, having seen as many exploits as there are out there these days. So
yeah, and this is a big shift for me too, going into security. Sorry for this is a big shift for me when I went into security. I worked in K through 12 for a decade, and security is a little lacking in certain areas in that field. And I went from K through 12 to higher ed, and then I jumped into fintech, and then I jumped into DoD contractor. So it's a huge paradigm shift for me, and I actually really respect it now that I actually see it all on the inside, and it's really opened my eyes to a lot.
Yeah, there's nothing like a trial by fire in that regard, right? So, so Aaron, where do you see the next year taking us, and how should we consider any reprioritizing that might be happening? Because we've already fixed our budgets, right? But there's probably still flexibility inside where we spend that money.
Right. I expect, in the coming year, the pressure is going to continue. Large scale attacks are getting cheaper and cheaper to perform. You can't let known issues slide, right? As mentioned before, every public disclosure of a vulnerability starts a clock until malicious automation is knocking at your door. The background noise of the internet has always had a bit of a dark tone, but at this point, there's just no room for mistakes, right? Protect those S3 buckets, keep those web configs tight, write good policies, measure everything. Uh, Speaking to other security practitioners, know what you're protecting, right? Be real practical about how you can align and help the business succeed. Even though your job can be hunting risks and standing on the wall protecting the business, figure out how to maintain a work-life balance and maintain your mental health. It's been a hard couple of years for security folks, but I promise, your businesses need you to succeed. And to do that, you have to survive the mission, right? Good tooling, good automation, excellent governance, all is going to help you hit those goals. So I think, ultimately the answer is less so reprioritizing and more so doubling down and renewing a focus on the fundamentals is the key.
Yeah, I feel like a buzzword that I'm hearing a lot these days is hyper automation, especially when it comes to DevSecOps or DevOps. And it feels like that protecting your work-life balance a lot of times comes down to, okay, something just happened. Now I have to script figuring out if it happened again, rather than doing any kind of manual work anymore, because life's just too short to do things manually.
So. The risk comes too quickly, right?
Yeah. If it happens once, guaranteed it's going to happen again, period.
Right.
So, Sarah, a lot of the people listening to this might be thinking of focusing on security as a big part of their career. I find it increasingly that people on the Apple side, because we have so much more work to do to make things function properly, end up with better understanding a lot of times of the internals of the systems we're helping to administer, protect, accelerate the adoption of. Where would you say, because you've had an excellent career arc, where would you say a traditional Apple administrator might be focusing future training on to be prepared for that challenge?
Well, it definitely depends on what their skill set is. What are they comfortable with? It's also a matter of, do they know what they don't know, kind of thing. So especially when you get to things like incident response, you don't want like just rando person saying, I'm going to go take this machine, I'm going to get an image of it and send it off or whatever analysis. Like, it's not that easy. Apple makes things surprisingly complicated. Well, not surprising to you all, but surprisingly complicated. So no situation is going to be the same. So, you can get training. There's plenty of training classes out there for this kind of stuff. There's also plenty of personal research that you can do if you are allowed to do some research, if you got time to do your own research, which I don't know if a lot of folks do have that these days. But it's just kind of one of those things, if you run into certain scenarios all the time, someone's always downloading malware on their system, or, someone's clicking a link that they shouldn't be clicking. You can run these as sort of tabletop exercises. You don't have to do it in the heat of the moment when you're stressing out and you're just like, wipe the machine. Don't just wipe the machine. There's good information there. But you can use that as kind of a way to expand how to be knowledgeable about collecting certain things, looking at certain security configurations. I think a lot of administrators probably know those probably better than I do. Or taking a look at the logs. And it's not just one set of logs. It's not just syslog. It's not just unified. There's audit logs. There's a boatload of logs, and they each have their own little tidbit of forensic pieces of information that you might need in an incident. Trying to figure out how to acquire certain data. If you have in-house forensics people, that's awesome. But small shops, they definitely do not have those type of folks to do that. So they want to try to do it on their own. And maybe you can do it with some of the basics. But I think one of the things they need to know is, what are your limitations? What are the limitations and kind of your tools as well? Tools are not going to show you everything. As much as we want that easy button, that doesn't quite work all the time. And, just expanding your own research and trying to figure out, how can you make your security overview a little bit better, piece it out.
Truly. It does feel like Apple has done a great job at building better and better APIs and frameworks and focusing less on the implementation details of those APIs and frameworks. And would you say that that has created a condition where, in order to get jobs in, let's say, InfoSec, it's becoming more and more of a vendor-based job track, where, as an example, you work at Celebrite, Celebrite training might be more valuable than the general CISSP or CEH type training events?
It really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, if you're doing more like the security configuration, you're probably not going to do a lot of forensic specific stuff. So it's going to depend. You're going to have to pick and choose, your professional courses. So I couldn't, without talking to an individual person on where they want to go. I'm happy to talk to anybody and be like, all right, what do you want to do? What do you want to get better at in your job? What do you need? Because it's going to be very specific to everybody. That's
fair. That answer is it depends. And thinking more deeply about, yeah, I would say thinking more deeply about what we want to do in the future is always going to better guide our choices and how and whom we choose to engage with mentoring and things of that nature. Since this question is actually pretty pertinent to all of us, Aaron, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Sarah's right, and I don't want to double down on the it depends, but you need to think about problems in a certain way, and getting your head wrapped around how you solve a security problem or identify a risk. It doesn't lend itself to read this textbook, right? It lends itself to gather and maximize your experience across as many areas as possible. You look at the big certifications you mentioned, CEH, CISSP, right? A great example. CISSP is an inch deep and a mile wide, and all that stuff is useful. But what is practical and useful to you in your situation? Look for mentoring, look for opportunities to maximize your experience across a wide array of security problems, and just be aware of where security can help and push yourself into those situations. Just make things just incrementally 1 inch better in very small ways repeatedly, and you'll get what you need to move ahead.
I love that. Build on top of previous findings and previous experiences. John, so you mentioned that you went from K-12 into FinTech and then into DoD type of work from there. That's a awesome career trajectory. Do you have any tidbits or anything you'd like to drop in there about, how tips and tricks on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's many tips and tricks. It just was how things panned out for me, at least. But I would say going from an area like K through 12 or higher ed, where security is not as in the forefront, to going to something like finance and DoD or what have you, go in open-minded. That's a big one for admins, really. When I first started in the financial company I worked at, it was a culture shock to me. It was like, holy cow, this is horrible work to do. Like, this is terrible. And how do people get work done? And then you have to go in and so the thing I did, I went in and I looked at all of the requirements and like, okay, this is why we do this. And I spoke with the cybersecurity teams and the people on the front line that are doing, the red teams and the our network security team, and tried to figure out, okay, why do we do this? Why do we do that? Okay, great. And I learned more about the process, and I also learned more about the products that we use to make sure that, okay, yeah, these are really important, and I understand the reason why we have it. But and then the good thing is I get in early on in this company, and get the Macs prepped, and I say, okay, I see how you do it, but we can make it better. So, you just have to go in with an open mind and say, okay, let's try not to force ourselves through the security. Let's try to dance with it and move with it, and try to make sure that the users can do their job, I guess, is the best way to put it, and make sure that I can do my job as well, because I do things that cybersecurity might say, that's bad, you shouldn't do that, and it's like, well, I have to, and I have to explain why I do certain things. That's a likely progression too, is going from an admin to somebody in security. I've had several friends who've done that. They've because they work so much with security, they get really hands-on it. They're like, you know what, I want to focus on macOS security, and let me do that. So it's it's something to just strive for if that's what you want to do, is just experience and open mind.
It does seem to be a growing field, and one that we can't just mint new security professionals after they take a week-long deep dive course, regrettably, especially with as much surface space. To Aaron's point, it's an inch deep, but there is a lot of surface space. Sarah mentioned, capturing an image, whether that's a golden smear or some kind of much more elaborate system to get those checksummed files in the exact place you need so that they're usable in the future, or whether it's administering antivirus, to your point earlier, like all of these things. It's like, wow, you have to know how to use 6 vendors' tools, all of which have different UX design teams, and put buttons in different places, and use words that maybe you don't even understand sometimes. So John, digging into the information security and working together piece, in order to be successful, the admins need to partner, and information security teams need to partner back. So do you have any tips, thoughts, tricks on how to build that relationship and trust?
Yeah, definitely. So this was a big part of my job for last year, is spinning up a Mac platform at our company, and making sure that they were secure. And this is also where I have a lot of experience. I have a technical writing degree, so presenting and talking to people and making things into turning nerd speak into English is where I strive. But so one thing I will say is information security needs to partner with not just IT, right? They need to partner with the entire organization, from the VPs to the developers to whomever is using your endpoint that you're trying to work with. You need to partner with them. And one good way to do this, though, to partner, is listen to your user base. They have a lot of information, and they're the ones that are going to be in the trenches doing the work, and you're going to be affecting them the most with security posture, security applications. So get feedback from them, good and bad, because good feedback is great because what you're doing is right, or what you're doing works well, so you should continue doing that. And bad feedback is even better because oh, that didn't work, let's not do that again. That's a really strong part of, I think, a good cybersecurity team, is a good communication skills with your user base, but it's also a good way to get users on your side and help them understand, why do I need this? And another one that's kind of important is, besides that, is make some concessions where possible. Make sure you're still compliant, but if there's a better way to do it, do you really need to bind your Macs to AD for that password complexity? Like, do you really? Probably not. You could do password complexity so much better, and Apple can recommend a much better way to do it, and Jamf can help you. And you still get that same compliance that you did with binding to AD, but you don't get the complexity that you had with binding to AD without the benefits.
Love that, and love that you mentioned working with the users. Informing people and informing them of, do you want this risk, or do you want us to just keep this risk on your behalf, because this is a potentially career-ending move.
Yeah, in my talk, I do go over that, about how cybersecurity is there to protect. They're not only there to protect the company, they're there to protect you, because if you do something silly or you do something that, what is it? Insider threat can happen accidentally, right? You don't know that it can happen to you, and if it does, you're out of luck, unfortunately. So we're there to, cybersecurity posture is there to protect the company and to protect you. So and people don't understand that.
Yeah.
We've spent a long time over the years in the security space blaming users, right? Oh, if they just wouldn't click those things, if they just wouldn't do that, something like that, But that it's just not the way to think about it, right? Firstly, all of us nerds, right? We made this world that's so complicated that you can never trust that you can click something. But the flip side of it is your best opportunity for information and security is at the user level. Encouraging them to make good decisions, that they understand, like John mentioned, that they understand why they're taking these actions. That is the greatest asset available.
Truly. Well, thank you three so much for joining. I am honored to have a panel like this to manage. And I would also say thank you to everyone who tunes in and listens throughout this and joins all these sessions at JNUC. You are truly the best customer base I've ever seen, and we're super, super lucky to have you. Have a great day.